here is the outline, what I'm planning to follow today. I will first share some examples of youth-led movements around the world, then discuss what youth means to show you the confusion over its definition, and then delve into the perceptions towards youth in peace and security nexus. And finally, I would like to share some examples from my fieldwork. I would like to start first with a collage of pictures, since visuals are always more powerful than the words. And all these pictures are from 2019. And I choose 2019 because it was a remarkable year in terms of youth mobilization and leadership. As you can see in these pictures, these are some of youth-led demonstrations around the world. For instance, in early 2009, Algerian president was hosted following months of youth-led street demonstrations. Likewise, there are some anti-government uprisings by youth, both in Iraq and Lebanon, at the very same time of period. And of course, there might be many other protests around the world that I missed in my quick browse for this presentation. But I'm sure that many of you noticed the worldwide protest to demand urgent action to tackle the climate action. And as you all know, millions of people all around the world from different countries, backgrounds, cultures, and time zones, they just united around the global coalition to put pressure on the leaders to act on the climate change. And all these movements appear to have one important thing in common. So this is the young people. They took initiative and raised their voice against their marginalization and also inequalities and so on. Of course, these are not the first ever youth-led protest in the world. We know from this story there were many others, and youth have always been at the forefront of political protests. But there is a tendency to ignore or underestimate their contributions. And youth-led demonstrations often receive criticism, like calls for the youth climate activist Greta Thunberg, like "shut up and go back to your school" by an Australian. And sometimes young activists are more sidelined or more directly sidelined. Is there anything wrong with this picture? So do you see any problems with this picture or problem with this picture? So let me just share with you the original one. Here is the original one. So this picture shows us not just the problem of the Associated Press for cropping a black Ugandan activist who is called Vanessa Nakate out of a picture, but it also shows us if you are both young and colored, then it means that you will be marginalized, which is also a persistent trend in media, unfortunately. I have been using the term of youth since the beginning of my speech, but what does it mean? And it's possible to classify definition of youth around three dominant types of approach, if I borrow from Professor Özerdem and Sukanya Poder, such as age-defined perspective, social construct perspective, and the psychological perspective. But to save some time and to give you more general picture of this confusion, I want to just focus on the first one, which is the age-defined perspective. And from the point of view of this perspective, youth are usually defined with some minor variations by the local, national, and international institutions, and mainly depend on the geographical context. And you can see the differences and overlaps between the age range of different institutions on the screen. Here is another classification for youth. And some of you might be familiar with this, with the term of the Generation Z, which refers to people who born after 1997. And this typology on this slide is from a report by Pew Research Center that specifically focus on the case of the US. And as you see, even from these two slides, there's a confusion about who youth are. These categories might be useful for all of us to understand some trends or to make some generalizations, but these kind of classifications are problematic, considering the fact that youth is not a homogeneous group, rather than it's highly heterogeneous in terms of gender, class, age, or in terms of their sexual orientations. And therefore, it's always important to keep in our mind that these are not like strict boundaries. to define any group of people, including youth. And I like an example by Alcindor Honvana, Professor Alcindor Honvana, who is an anthropologist. She mentioned that a 40-year-old unemployed and unmarried African man may still be considered as a youth man in the case of Africa. So it is possible to say that the term youth is a social construct. I'm interested in this youth issue because youths are frequently othered in the discourse on security. And they are usually seen as the potentially dangerous subjects. And most of the time, policy approach regard them as the source of problem by identifying youth as troublemakers. And there has been an increasing attention to the relationship between youth and violence with the rapid growth of their population all around the world, especially in less developed countries. And the literature on youth role, particularly in peace and conflict studies, it overwhelmingly tends to be negative. Especially the existence of large number of male youth is considered as the potential source of instability. For instance, if I just give an example from a scholar again, who is called Henrik Urdal. So he argues that youth bulks are significantly increase the risk of 3 different forms of internal political violence. And these are the domestic armed conflict first, second one is the terrorism, and the third one is the violent demonstrations. And he argues the risk of violence in countries, especially in the Middle East, Africa, or parts of Asia, because or due to the excessive number of youth. So these countries or these continents are having the higher risk of violence in these countries. And as you can see from the slide, Africa is the region where the largest youth population locates. And this number is expected to rise considerably in very near future. And this negative understanding of youth involvement in conflict may hold merit, but it has some limitations. For instance, this perspective or like ignore the agents of female youth, or we can say that female youth is overlooked and denied in these simple male-female stereotypes. And as you see, some of my pictures in the slide, most of them represent male youth. However, the situation is different in reality. And there are some studies or some scholars who focus on the female warriors or the role of female in armed conflict or the armed groups worldwide, and especially in the case of Africa, it's quite popular. And another limitation of this perspective is the exclusion of the impact of youth in post-conflict situations especially. And youth are often neglected in peace negotiations, like the mobilization programs and the post-conflict reconstruction. And in short, again, if I borrow from Professor Özerdem and Professor Potter, there are 2 extreme perceptions of youth. And one is the infantilizing, which refers to view youth as vulnerable or in need of protection. And the second extreme perception is the demonizing, which refers to view youth as dangerous, violent, or as threats to security, as I already mentioned. And both make youth less visible in peace processes. And this is the pessimist and the negative side of the equation or the literature. But there's also the other side of the coin, which I would like to focus now. In the last 2 decades, many researchers have started to focus on especially the potential of youth in peace and began to change the negative discourse on the role of youth towards a more positive one. And as the most recent addition to the conflict resolution, the concept of peace building challenged the previous approach. And I know that we don't have time, too much time to discuss all different approaches on peace building. But what I mean by peace building is simply a comprehensive process that tries to remove the root causes of a conflict. And peace building is a process which often considered as a state-centric and top-down approach, because it mainly focuses on promoting like market economy, Western-style democracy in transforming the conflicting societies or countries with the assumption that these new features of a country or a society will prevent further conflict. However, there has been strong criticism against this focus, mainly because the mainstream approach mainly underestimates or ignores the needs of conflicting states or the communities. And it is just focusing on prevention of the direct violence and the transformation of its system. And particularly some academics affiliated with the critical account of peace and conflict studies, where I also see myself as a part of this group, they increase the attention on the local ownership, like everyday, the agency, which are often overlooked by the mainstream peace-building approach. And in line with this critical understanding, the agency of youth, and especially their voices and their experiences, recently began to acknowledge by scholars. And this shift in the focus on the perspective and the position of youth as an agent of, or as an agent in the wider society have showed the importance of possible role of youth, particularly as the agents of change, so which is the third, and the positive perceptions towards the youth, especially in the peace situation. And oops, let me just change the slide, yes. And all these positive contributions of youth also reflected to the reports of institutions like UNDP, USAID, or let's say UN Security Council resolutions. And I would like to share one of them with you to make you familiar, since it marks a milestone in recognition of youth's efforts and positive contributions, especially in prevention and the resolution of conflicts. So this is the UN Security Council resolution called 2250, which adopted in 2015 on youth, peace and security, and which is followed by subsequent resolutions on the very same issue in 2018. And the most recent one is in July 2020, which is called the UN Security Council resolution of 2535. These are the important regulations, or let's say resolutions by the UN Security Council, which UN Security Council just urged countries to adopt or to include youth more in especially the peace building and the decision-making mechanisms. So all these developments in terms of transformation in the discourse toward a more positive one, or progress in practice, are quite important. But I'm also aware of the fact that there's still much to do to affect a broader change and to construct and to constructively incorporate youth voices. And I'm still hopeful. I should admit that I'm still hopeful, considering youth's active stance on the issue, and also the significant progress at the international level with UN Security Council resolutions. And in my research, so let me just give you some concrete examples from my research on Cyprus. And where I focus on the Cypriot youth role in peace building with the support of European Union under the Marie-Curie grant. I also observed many individual and collective contributions by youth at everyday level. And in the Cyprus case, I try to investigate the youth's narrative on peace, since this is an interesting case study, or a country which has been politically divided more than 55 years and physically divided more than 45 years, as you can see on the map. And the Greek and Turkish Cypriot community leaders still think that a peace accord will fulfill all the needs of their respective communities. However, during my fieldwork, when I discuss these issues with the Cypriot youth on both sides, it's possible to see that their perceptions and the priorities are quite different than what is discussed at the elite level. So this is the reason that I have a completely different and critical perspective, which focus on the bottom-up perspective, or the inclusive peace-building process to make or to reach a peace in Cyprus. And this difference between leadership and the societal level, particularly on the youth level, because I just focus on the youth of the country, is important, considering the fact that a peace agreement success depends on whether the next generations accept or reject it, which I borrow from Siobhan McAvoy-Levy, who is quite an influential figure in terms of youth and peace building. And as Cypriot youth on both sides of the island challenge these realities in their everyday lives, it's important to understand the importance of their views on peace in constructing a more effective bottom-up approach. And the peace negotiations for Cyprus have long shaped around 6 main and overarching negotiation dossiers, including like territory, governance and power sharing, economic affairs, property, European Union affairs, and securities and guarantees. But when I ask my participants what peace means to them, I can classify their answers based on frequency within 3 main and interrelated themes. One is the social cohesion, the second one is the no discrimination or hatred, and the third one is the unrestricted freedom of movement, as you can also see on the table. And regarding the social cohesion, it's possible to say that while Cypriot youth on both sides explain what peace means to them, they frequently emphasize like living together, respecting differences, respecting each other, interacting with each other, like building friendship and living in a harmony with the participation of all communities, and all of which can be categorized as a social interactions rather than focusing on like overarching terms that I mentioned as the negotiation dossiers, like security and guarantees or power sharing. So youth have their own priorities, their own needs. So this is the reason that there should be a interaction or the contact between the societal level and the elite level. And you can also see some of the instances from my interviews with Cypriot youth on both sides. I should also remind that it's impossible to generalize these results of my fieldwork because beyond the research participants, but it still shows us something different. So youth perceptions and priorities are different than their community leaders. And this shows why youth perception is quite important if someone wants to find a solution, especially if you keep in your mind that the fact that young people in Cyprus are not optimistic, and it belongs to both sides of the equation or the division in terms of a solution. And as you can see on the figure on your screen, so more than half of the both Turkish and Greek Cypriot youth thinks that Cyprus problem will never be solved. And they don't believe that their community leaders will achieve a solution at the end. And this is why I focus on Cypriot youth in my research, to deliver their messages and to provide some help to make their opinions visible. And very recently, I wrote a policy paper, which will be published very soon in Cyprus, to share some policy recommendations with their community leaders and all involved parties to reflect youth demands. And to conclude or sum up what I'm saying or what I'm trying to say in this presentation, there are completely opposite views in the literature, especially in peace and conflict studies, and also in practice on the role of youth. And the role of youth is mainly shaped around the perception of them and whether they are considered as a problem or a potential. And it is obvious from my collage of pictures at the beginning of my presentation, most of youth in many countries have no longer trust the state's willingness or the politicians' ability to find solutions to their problems, like the Cypriot youth. I'm aware of the fact that I'm just generalizing this issue, but if I just speak about my fieldwork experience, so I can say that at least it's valid for Cypriot youth. Or if I think that why there are lots of youth-led social movements around the world, it also gives me some idea to make this generalization. And this is the reason that youth take the initiative and involve in protests, gather in social media, and organize and establish some individual or collective bodies to raise their voice. Parliamentary representation by individuals under the age of 35 is 2% in the north and 9% in the south. So which shows that youth are underrepresented. And when I ask youth whether you feel that you are represented in the politics sufficiently, they all say no, because the political parties, they don't let them to involve with the politics. And apart from the youth wings of political parties, there are no bodies that youth can raise their voice. So this is the reason that they just, especially in the northern Cyprus, it's quite popular. They just establish their own associations to discuss their own problems and to deliver it to the politicians. Greek Cypriot youths are quite lucky in that terms because they have a body which is called Youth Board of Cyprus, which includes the representatives from all youth wings of political parties. So they can discuss there and they can just deliver their messages directly to the minister. And when you look at the last European Parliament election, turnout among youth is very low because they don't trust politicians. They don't trust political institutions. This is a peace building process, and it's a comprehensive process, and it's a long-term process. So this is the reason that parties on both sides have to work on these confidence building measures on daily basis, and it should be a very regular way. Otherwise, it won't be possible to reach a solution. Peace process in Cyprus in general should be inclusive, and both respective parties have to hear their youth needs and demands. Otherwise, they don't understand what they want and how they can encourage these people. So this is the reason that I wrote the policy report, to just give them an idea about what are the steps they should take and how they increase youth involvement in decision-making process, in the peace process, because they want to be part of it. And it's obvious from my research, they want to take part in peace process, whatever they understand from peace. And this will change the attitudes of youth towards a more positive way or towards a more solution-oriented way.